The morning air hung heavy with tension as Karen Vanderholt, the self-appointed enforcer of Cedar Grove Estates, burst onto Marcus Reed's front porch brandishing a sheaf of damning legal documents that she claimed bore the county judge's seal and commanded Marcus to vacate his home by noon or face immediate arrest and contempt of court charges, while curious neighbors peered through drawn curtains and whispered in alarm at the sight of her triumphant smirk and oversized pearl earrings glinting in the sunlight, and the palpable fear rippling through his young daughter's shoulders at the sight of the papers that Karen waved like a victory flag above her head. But Marcus, a retired Air Force mechanic who had spent 20 years serving his country and 10 more rebuilding his community after storms, refused to cower in the face of her bullying tactics, and while Karen gloated over her apparent triumph, Marcus noticed a telltale misalignment in the embossed seal, the judge's name spelled incorrectly, and a mismatched signature scrawled across the bottom that read like a forgery. And so he squared his shoulders, met her sneer with unwavering calm, and said in a clear, unwavering voice that resonated with the pride of every mile he'd flown and every mission he'd completed, that he intended to see those papers verified before he handed over the keys to his home or his dignity. And Karen's expression flickered briefly with uncertainty before she recovered and narrowed her eyes, her lips curling in a snarl as she threatened to have him hauled off to jail on the spot, a hollow promise that rang false even as she uttered it. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through Cedar Grove Estates, sending ripples of outrage through the community and prompting Mrs. Lynn, the retired librarian next door, to dust off her decades-old law reference books, Mr. Patel, the neighborhood IT guru, to magnify photographs of the dubious seal until the flaws leapt into focus, and even the teenage mail carrier Jasmine, to peek over the fence and nod gravely at Marcus as though foreseeing the injustice he would soon overcome. And by midday Marcus stood in Judge Myers's ornate courtroom clutching the counterfeit papers as the bailiff called the case, and Karen swaggered in behind him, her posture rigid with confidence, certain that today she'd finally proved her dominance over the man who dared challenge her HOA edicts. And as the judge peered over his spectacles and examined the documents, a hush fell over the gallery, broken only by Karen's triumphant cough and the soft click of a camera shutter as a neighbor recorded the spectacle for posterity and for the HOA's weekly newsletter. But within moments the judge's lips curved into a wry smile, his eyes dancing with amusement as he tapped the paper and intoned that he regretted to inform Karen Vanderholt that these papers were, in fact, utterly invalid, bearing neither the proper seal nor signature of the court, and that presenting fabricated judicial orders constituted contempt of court, obstruction of justice, and attempted fraud. And Karen's jaw dropped in real time as the gravity of her blunder dawned on her, and the entire courtroom erupted into laughter at the absurdity of her hubris. And as murmurs of disbelief and schadenfreude filled every corner of the room, many residents who had initially supported her griped about her heavy-handed tactics. Marcus allowed himself a small, proud smile, though he remained composed, his military discipline evident in how he straightened his back and waited for the judge to finish. Then came the moment of reckoning. The judge banged his gavel as though calling lightning down in that wood-paneled arena and, with no hint of mercy for the person who had nearly upended an innocent family's life, ordered the bailiff to step forward and place genuine handcuffs on Karen's wrists before reading her rights aloud. And as those cold steel bracelets clicked shut, there was an audible gasp from the crowd, and the once feared HOA queen, who had strutted through the neighborhood wielding fines and threats like weapons, was led from the bench in disgrace, her pearls rattling against her neck, her crimson lipstick smudged, and the echo of her downfall reverberated through the courtroom like thunder. Outside the courthouse, Marcus guided his daughter into his arms, ruffling her hair and promising her that no bully would ever take their home again. And as the family embraced, reporters jostled each other for a glimpse, scribbling notes about the day justice trumped deception, and word spread that the HOA board had called an emergency meeting to distance themselves from Karen's disgrace and to announce sweeping reforms, verification protocols for any legal documents, mandatory legal audits before any eviction notices could be issued, and community-elected review panels to prevent any future abuse of power. And in the weeks that followed, the wooden sign that stood outside Marcus's home, hand-painted with the words "Fake Papers, Real Justice," became a local symbol of accountability and resilience, filmed by drone enthusiasts, photographed by self-appointed journalists, and even printed in the county newspaper's human interest section as a reminder that no one, regardless of ego or title, was above the law. In the end, Karen Vanderholt's failed coup cost her not only her position but also her reputation and her HOA membership, as neighbors who once glowed at her proximity now crossed the street to avoid her and whispered questions about how someone could fall so far so fast. And Marcus, for his part, dedicated himself to guiding others through the legal system, volunteering at community centers, and teaching conflict resolution workshops at the local church, determined to turn his own ordeal into a catalyst for positive change and to ensure that his daughter would grow up knowing that courage, truth, and perseverance could topple even the most intimidating facade of power. And when asked about the wooden sign, he said, with a soft chuckle, that sometimes the simplest messages carried the most weight. And as the sun set on Cedar Grove Estates, casting long shadows across neatly trimmed lawns, neighbors paused to reflect on what had transpired, and the story of Karen's fake papers and real handcuffs lingered in the air like a lesson learned the hard way. Was Karen ever justified in trying to scare a family into submission with forged orders? Or was her downfall proof that lies only run so far before the truth catches up? Share your thoughts, right or wrong. As autumn settled over Cedar Grove Estates, the story of Karen Vanderholt's spectacular downfall rippled through every household and echoed in conversations at the local coffee shop, the barber's chair, and the community center where Marcus Reed, still guided by resolve and compassion, launched a series of free legal literacy workshops aimed at empowering residents to understand their rights and recognize fraudulent documents or overreach by self-appointed authorities. At the very first session, held in the repurposed common room that once hosted HOA board meetings, Marcus stood before a semicircle of retired teachers, busy parents juggling toddlers, and curious teens who represented the first generation raised in the tightly policed enclave. His calm voice carried through the room as he outlined the fundamentals of how court orders are issued, the strict procedures for seals and signatures, and the simple red flags that anyone could spot with just a keen eye and a camera phone. He demonstrated side-by-side comparisons of genuine county paperwork and the counterfeit ones that Karen had waved in his face, zooming in on the misaligned embossing, the misspelled judge's name, and the off-kilter signature that looked as though it had been traced by someone who barely recognized cursive as a form of writing. The crowd murmured in recognition. Many remembered the fear that had settled in their stomachs when Karen first delivered her bogus eviction notice to the Thompsons down the street, a family with 3 young children who had tearfully packed their belongings until Mr. Thompson discovered the truth online and forced Karen to admit her mistake in front of the entire neighborhood. Marcus allowed a gentle smile to settle on his lips as he recounted that day's dramatic revelation, punctuating his anecdote with a reminder that knowledge was the community's best defense against manipulation. In the weeks that followed, attendance at the workshop swelled until the small common room could no longer accommodate the eager faces lined up to register, eager to learn how to protect their homes and families from arbitrary threats. Meanwhile, the HOA board, chastened by the public relations nightmare unleashed by Karen's arrest, scrambled to implement the judge's mandated reforms, which included a thorough audit of every document distributed under the HOA letterhead, the appointment of an external legal advisor to vet any future notices, and the creation of an appeals committee made up of volunteer homeowners who would serve as an impartial check on the board's power. But even as the board issued bland public statements professing their renewed commitment to transparency, rumors swirled among neighbors that a remnant faction of Karen's loyalists was plotting to reinstate her as an influential voice behind the scenes, prompting late-night strategy sessions at Moonlight Bakery and whispered conversations in the parking lots of the nearby supermarket. One chilly October evening, a small group of concerned homeowners led by Mrs. Lynn confronted the board president, Mr. Hernandez, in a hastily organized town hall meeting under the flicker of fluorescent lights and the hum of a borrowed microphone. Lines of handwritten grievances formed a tapestry of frustration across the projector screen. Threats of fines delivered without explanation, parking spaces reassigned at a moment's notice, and the lingering fear that someone as reckless as Karen could again exploit procedural loopholes. When Mr. Hernandez attempted to deflect the criticism by citing outdated bylaws and citing vague notions of community standards, the room erupted in disapproving groans and calls for accountability. Marcus quietly observed from the back, proud to witness the transformation of his neighbors from fearful subjects into informed citizens empowered to speak up and demand fair treatment. Days later, leaflets began to appear on doorsteps emblazoned with the stylized version of the wooden sign outside Marcus' house. Fake papers, real justice. But beneath the slogan in crisp type text came a new call to action. Attend the community forum on established HOA procedures this Saturday at 10. Slides laid out the agenda for an open debate on how decisions would be made going forward, who would have oversight, and how residents could challenge any directive they deemed unjust. Interest peaked among even the most apathetic homeowners, and Saturday morning found the community forum room packed to capacity with folding chairs lining every inch of wall space and standing room only in the aisle as the debate unfolded. Karen's absence, mandatory under the terms of her release and restricted by the injunction barring her from HOA functions, was palpable. Her empty chair at the front table symbolized the downfall of unchecked power, but also served as a stark reminder of how close the neighborhood had come to losing its cohesion altogether. Throughout the spirited discussion, Marcus and his daughter passed out printed guides to procedural fairness. Every hand raised was met with respectful listening, and every concern was addressed with concrete steps for resolution. By the end of the forum, the board had agreed to a binding set of reforms codified in an official addendum to the HOA covenants, including a transparent appeals process, rotating board memberships to prevent long-term entrenchment, and a commitment to quarterly legal audits to catch any irregularities before they could balloon into crises outside. As neighbors lingered in clusters, exchanging phone numbers and promising to look out for one another, Marcus' daughter tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Dad, do you think they'll be okay now?" He tousled her hair and replied softly that courage and vigilance would always be their community's best defense, and that as long as they kept learning and standing together, no Karen's fake paper army could ever threaten their home again. But Karen's story did not end with courthouse humiliation and community reform, for in the weeks that followed she attempted a belated legal appeal. Citing technicalities in the judge's contempt ruling, her motion was accompanied by a frantic social media campaign, in which she portrayed herself as the victim of an overzealous homeowner, accusing Marcus of inciting crowds against her, and demanding a public apology from the man who dared to challenge her authority. Recorded phone calls that she released to local news outlets painted Marcus' calm, measured responses in a hostile light, twisting his warnings about legal literacy into accusations of fear-mongering and agitation. The campaign took off among a small but vocal online faction who had always detested the HOA's strict covenants and found in Karen's crusade an opportunity to rail against elitist homeowner clubs and property fascism. Within days, the Cedar Grove Estates Facebook group devolved into a rancorous battleground, with old friends trading barbed comments and new factions forming around hashtags like Free Karen and Justice for HOA. But rather than rise to the bait, Marcus convened a counter-response, not with angry posts or incendiary language, but with an invitation to all group members to join him for a live-streamed Q&A session where he would answer questions about the real meaning of community, transparency, and the rule of law. He explained in clear, accessible terms that reform was not about silencing differing opinions but about establishing fair procedures so everyone, from lifelong residents to newcomers, could have their voices heard without resorting to intimidation or deception. He demonstrated how the new appeals process worked, walked through mock cases, and fielded difficult questions with patience and respect. As thousands watched online and many more attended in person at the clubhouse, the live-stream chat transformed from a frenzy of accusations into a steady stream of inquisitive queries and supportive messages of gratitude. By the end of the session, even some of Karen's former allies had reached out privately to thank Marcus for his candor and to ask how they could help maintain the new standards of accountability. But true to her combative nature, Karen refused to back down, filing a complaint against Marcus' daughter's school, claiming that his community events amounted to partisan political activity, a charge that, if upheld, threatened to bar her from attending any HOA gatherings and further tarnish her reputation. The complaint, however, unraveled almost as quickly as her fake court papers had. The school district's legal team dismissed the charge as frivolous, citing explicit exemptions for civic education events and praising Marcus' emphasis on legal literacy as beneficial for young voters. The dismissal made headlines in the local paper and ironically elevated Marcus' workshops to wider recognition as a model for civic engagement in suburbia. Even journalists who had earlier played up the drama now framed the story as one of transformation. How a community under siege by its own self-styled enforcer had not only expelled tyranny but had emerged stronger, more united, and equipped with the tools to guard against future abuses. In the months that followed, Marcus' daughter, emboldened by her father's example, organized a youth-led neighborhood watch program that combined evening patrols with educational sessions on respectful conflict resolution and restorative justice practices. The program welcomed teens of all backgrounds and provided a constructive outlet for youthful energy and civic-mindedness, while Karen, having exhausted her appeals and facing mounting legal bills, retreated from public life into a small rental apartment on the outskirts of town. Her social media presence dwindled, Her once gleaming wardrobe was replaced by unassuming sweaters, and rumors circulated that she was seeking therapy to address her obsessive need for control, yet whispers of her return persisted, fueling speculation that she might stage a comeback. In anticipation, the HOA board, now bolstered by members elected through the reformed process, set aside discretionary funds to hire a part-time ombudsman whose sole role was to mediate disputes impartially and prevent any individual from wielding disproportionate influence. The church down the street offered its basement for monthly community commons gatherings where residents could propose new bylaws, debate policy ideas, or simply share a potluck meal and stories of the lessons they had learned from the saga of Karen Vanderholt. A year after the day the judge had snapped real handcuffs onto Karen's wrists, the wooden sign outside Marcus' home remained. Fake papers, real justice, but now, etched beneath it in neat letters, was a second line added by Marcus' daughter during a late-night arts and crafts session. Knowledge is our strongest shield. Together, they stood as a testament to a neighborhood that refused to be cowed by arrogance and forgery, a community that had reclaimed its own narrative through empathy, education, and unity. However, as winter approached and lights blinked on in every window bearing miniature snowmen and icicles, it became clear that vigilance remained essential, for even the most well-intentioned reforms could falter without continued engagement. Late one December evening, as Marcus and his daughter walked home beneath a sky brimming with stars, he turned to her and said softly that justice was not a one-time victory but a daily practice of listening, learning, and standing up for the vulnerable. She nodded, clutching her coat tighter against the chill, and asked whether she would ever see Karen again. He offered a gentle smile and replied that perhaps she would, but that if she chose to return it would be because the community had left the door open to dialogue rather than closed it with scorn. And as they reached their front gate, a single snowflake drifting between them, Marcus whispered that sometimes the greatest triumphs lay not in punishment but in offering pathways to redemption, provided they were built on truth, accountability, and mutual respect.